So welcome everyone to this second edition of Bilateral, which is a series of fireside chats virtually that the Coalition for the UN We Need hosts to discuss transforming global governance. C4UN, for those who don't know it, is a platform to mobilize civil society organizations and multi-stakeholder coalitions in renewing, helping innovate, and strengthening the UN system. My name is Heba Ali. I'm a senior advisor at the Coalition, and I'll be your host today. Today's Bilateral is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube, so you can look out for that and share with others. In our inaugural Bilateral, we sat down with former Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven to discuss the legacy of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, which he chaired, and how to get buy-in for international cooperation from the political right. If you missed that, we'll put a link to it in the chat, and you can sign up to C4UN's mailing list to get updates about future events, including future editions of Bilateral. Tiny bit of housekeeping before we get started. We have received several questions from you in advance. If time allows, we'll try to turn to additional questions live, so we will be able to we will need to identify you, so make sure that your name and organization appear and put your questions into the Q&A function. And otherwise, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And I will jump right into business. So today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Stephen Heintz, President and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is a philanthropic foundation that advances social change for a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. Stephen has led the foundation for more than 2 decades now, but began his career in the U.S. public service, went on to found a public policy organization called Demos that tries to broaden citizen engagement in American democracy. He spent time in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall with the East-West Institute, and over the years has been involved in many diplomatic efforts and often breakthroughs behind the scenes, from helping set Kosovo on its path to independence to helping launch the Track 2 dialogue that contributed to laying the groundwork for the Iran nuclear deal. He remains in close contact with the leadership of Iran, with officials in China, with policymakers in the US, so hopefully can bring some of those perspectives into our conversation today. But we are speaking to Stephen largely because of a report he published last year called A Logic for the Future, International Relations in the Age of Turbulence. We'll put a link to the report into the chat. And in this report, Stephen, you lay out a vision for a new international logic that shifts from, on the one hand, a focus on national sovereignty to, on the other, collaborative and human sovereignty, from the primacy of the national interest to a focus on the global commons, from great power dominance to equitable distribution of power. And I had a sneak peek at the report in April of last year, and it really stuck with me because I think we talk a lot about reforming multilateralism, but I have rarely read such a clear articulation of how it should change. And that sounds simple, but actually we don't often take the time to craft the vision of what we want to see. So thank you for that important contribution, and welcome to Bilateral.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Heba, and thanks for reading the paper so closely. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, I promise you. But maybe before I get into all of my questions, this paper is getting a lot of attention. I'd be curious to hear from you why you think that is, and kind of what gap you were trying to fill when you set out to write this essay in the first place.
Well, I should say that I had the extraordinary good fortune to be awarded a fellowship by the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, who invited me to come to Berlin with a small cohort of fellow fellows and undertake a project of my choosing that they would help support. And given, as you described it, my kind of long engagement in international affairs and my growing concern that the existing international system is anachronistic at best and obsolete in some cases, we simply aren't managing the global challenges we face in an effective manner. And so I decided to go back and study the origins and evolution and strengths and weaknesses of the existing international system, and then think about what steps we might take to create an international system that will deliver far less violent conflict, greater equitable prosperity, and a sustainable planet in the remaining decades of this century. And so that was the motivation and the project that I undertook. And I have to say it was a challenging, obviously it's a huge topic. And I went back, to the very beginnings of the current system, which really can be traced to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And I studied it, all the evolution of it going forward to the present day, and tried to draw from that what is the logic that drives the current internationalist system, and what might we shift to create a logic for the future that will guide us in actually structuring a new system that can deliver peace, prosperity, and sustainability.
Give us an outline of the vision that you describe in the paper.
So I think we just need to be, on the one hand, realists and start from where the world is that we live in. And what we are experiencing is very deep global interdependencies, a multi-power reality, and great turbulence, unprecedented turbulence. This is people challenge this claim, but I think if you look at the turbulence in our world today, the wars that are underway, more violent conflicts than any time in 3 decades, an accelerating climate crisis with the kinds of effects we're seeing in California in the last weeks, and many others. The potential for hyper disruptive technology in AI, but also biotechnology and nanotechnology, a new nuclear arms race, and the list goes on. And it is the confluence of these factors and the fact that we really have 3 potentially existential threats that we face simultaneously, climate, nuclear, and disruptive technologies, that require us to think differently about the international system. And so this is what I tried to outline. And what I concluded was we need a new logic. We need a new ethos. We need to base our global affairs on caring and sharing, caring for one another as a human population, and sharing more equitably the resources of this planet in a sustainable way. And we need a revision to the institutions and mechanisms and processes of international relations.
I mean, the paper is so rich in it. It's unfortunate because we can't get into each of the shifts, but I mentioned at the start that we, in our first bilateral, spoke to the co-chair of the Secretary General's high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. And in that report, they propose that our global governance system should be redesigned around equitable access to global public goods. You have that in your report, among many other ideas. Which of these shifts do you consider to be the most important as a normative underpinning of our future international relations? I'm sure you're going to not want to pick one, but is there one that could help kind of unlock the others, to your mind?
Well, it's like picking your favorite child.
Yeah.
It is a bit of a challenge. And I also want to say, as I answer that question, that I was very impressed with the report of the high-level advisory body and drew on their work, among other sources, as I was conducting my research. If you'll permit me, maybe I'll pick 3. I think the first one, shifting from anthropocentrism to an understanding of the full community of life, is absolutely essential for human survival and obviously for planetary sustainability. Second, I would say great power dominance to a more equitable distribution of power in this multipolar reality. I think we need to be moving toward a multipolar pluralism in which we accept different systems of governance, even when we have significant differences with them, in pursuit of solving global problems. So that would be the second one. And maybe the third one is moving out of the Cold War logic of zero-sum approaches and blocs of allies, and moving towards something that is more about positive sum solutions and variable alignment where nations will be aligned on some issues and may not be aligned with the same set of nations on others, and that's okay as long as it helps reduce conflict. So those, I guess I would, I'm sorry to not pick one, but I think those three are kind of central.
I want to come back to the last one that you mentioned in a minute, but I'm surprised you didn't mention national sovereignty, because for me that jumped out right away. A shift away from national sovereignty towards this idea of collaborative and human sovereignty. And actually, in looking at some of the questions that have come from the audience, this notion of collaborative and human sovereignty keeps coming up. Um, National sovereignty and I suppose the broader concept of non-interference in states' internal affairs has been this kind of untouchable tenet of international relations, dating back, as you pointed out in the essay, and just now also to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, all the way up to the UN Charter. We've certainly seen in recent negotiations at the Summit of the Future and in other intergovernmental processes, many countries, but among them Russia and the US in particular, really pushing back on anything that could be seen to infringe on national sovereignty. What's the pathway, to your mind, to loosening the grip that that has over our international relations?
Well, I think that question is exactly why I didn't put it in the top three that I just offered, because this is a deeply ingrained mindset, and it's also a deeply ingrained structure of international relations, as you pointed out. It is literally codified and has been codified in international law since the end of the 30 Years' War, and then, of course, the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna, and then the League of Nations, and then the UN. This notion that national sovereignty should be, in fact, the basis of international relations. And so moving away from it, while, in my view, essential, is one of the most complicated things we will need to accomplish, because it is so deeply ingrained in what we teach in schools of international relations, in how we conduct diplomacy, how we conduct economic diplomacy. And while the shift is necessary, it is going to be a slow and complicated process. Now, what gives me some hope in this regard is that we have seen some extraordinary efforts in this regard, and I cite the European Union in the paper, which I say I think is really the most significant political accomplishment of the post-World War II era, because it is an example of shared or collaborative sovereignty that has provided for peaceful relations on the European continent, a growing and vibrant economy, and greater power in global affairs, because they have in fact pooled their sovereignty in order to create a greater a larger presence in global affairs. So, and we see this happening through other regional organizations, obviously not as far advanced as the European Union, but I'm encouraged by the African Union. I think that ASEAN has accomplished a great deal. And one of the things I suggest in this paper is, as we do try to make this shift away from an exclusive focus on national sovereignty, we strengthen these regional organizations and link them together and link them to the UN in more structural kinds of ways to help strengthen the notion of collaborative or pooled sovereignty.
The EU example is compelling, but you do get the pushback that the countries that make up the EU have a homogeneity that doesn't exist when you try to do that at the global scale. A number of questions came from the audience around this idea of either a world parliament or a UN parliamentary assembly. We had one member of the audience saying effective democratic governance, quoting you, saying effective democratic governance must be the cornerstone of the international system, and asking whether you support the call for a world parliament or a UN parliamentary assembly whereby citizens could elect their representatives at the international stage. Do you think that that notion is fundamentally different, or that the comparison with the EU is not appropriate, or are there lessons that we can learn from the EU, both successes and things to avoid in actually trying to move towards a world parliament?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really do support the ongoing exploration of some kind of world parliament or parliamentary assembly or other mechanisms that give citizens a greater voice in global affairs. I think that is really important. Um, and I'm open to different models. And I also was interested that leading up to the Summit of the Future, there were some citizen assemblies that were organized around the world to get citizen voices more directly into the process. So all of these efforts to create democratic methods of engaging citizens, I really support. And I really want to compliment C4UN because as I see it, you are the leading coalition of civil society forces thinking about and concerned about and interested in the international system. And one of the other points that I make in the paper is that I think there should be an undersecretary at the UN for civil society so that there is a direct link, a mandate, and closer relations. And that too can contribute, over time to the notion of some parliamentary assembly, some UN parliament itself or world parliament. And the European Union is a good example of this. After all, they do have a European Parliament. And like all democratic systems, it has its flaws, and I think there are some lessons to be learned, in particular around some of the decision making that requires unanimity, which I think is holding both the UN Security Council and some of the other UN agencies like the COP process of the UNFCCC, and also the European Union. So we can learn from these lessons, and this will be an evolutionary process. I don't think we have invented the right answer yet for how to involve citizens more directly in global affairs, but I really appreciate the work that's being done on it, and I think we have to invent it. We just have more work to do in order to accomplish that.
Thanks for your kind words about C4UN. I think it is quite troubling, actually, that there are so few mechanisms at the moment for civil society to engage meaningfully, and I underline that part of the word. But certainly, as you say, a lot of efforts in that vein, including citizens' assemblies and suggestions that with a certain number of votes, with citizens around the world signing a petition, you could automatically trigger a General Assembly debate. So a lot of interesting, I think, ideas to that end. Another slightly different track of idea that you propose is the idea of replacing the Trustee Council, which was created to manage the transition of formerly colonized countries to self-government, into a climate council. And you mentioned off the top what's happening in California right now. Very timely, of course. This is similar to an idea proposed by the Global Governance Forum in their second charter proposal. They call it an Earth System Council, but this idea that elevating the current architecture, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, could allow for some breakthroughs in terms of climate governance. We all see the problems with the lack of enforcement of decisions taken at COP. What would allow a new body, if we were to create a kind of climate council, to have real teeth if the same actors are trying to sabotage it? How do you see that opening up some space?
Well, that is the key question, and I don't, I'll be very honest, I don't think I have a particularly effective answer to it yet. I do think that the first step is elevating the importance of climate and making it much more central to the UN itself, and that's why I suggest this notion of a climate council. And I have read the Global Governance Forum suggestion as well, and I think I'm glad that they and I didn't read it until last week, so I wasn't aware of it, but I'm glad that they're thinking about this as well. I think that the UN FCCC process has become way too cumbersome. It's way too big. It's ineffective. It does not have enforcement mechanisms. It's in some ways, given the nature of that process, it's a bit of a miracle that it's accomplished what it's accomplished, but it isn't enough because the climate crisis is accelerating every day. and is literally an existential threat. So, A, we need to make it more central to the work of the UN, which is why I suggest this council. B, I hope that it would stimulate debate about enforcement mechanisms. And C, I hope that it would also be a place for resolving differences and coordinating, different points of view about how to address the climate crisis in a more structured way. It will not be perfect. It is not the ideal solution, but I think it's definitely a step forward that is necessary to take.
I guess the bigger question here is, and it actually points to one of the shifts in your paper where you talk about needing to move from internationalism to what you call internationalism consistently upheld. What's the point of changing the structures and the norms if anyway they're going to be disregarded and violated?
Yeah, well, that's that's absolutely right. And one of the things that I try to point out in this paper is that we need to change the normative view of international law, and it's and, make the case that this is not optional. International law is not something you pay attention to when it's convenient. International law is something that you pay attention to, period. And if we can't make that mind shift, we will not manage the kinds of global threats that we face in an effective way. And here, I think it's important, especially for those of us who are Americans, to be honest about the fact that the biggest shift has to be in U.S. foreign policy and in U.S. attitudes. And that's why one of my 10 building blocks of the new system is transformed U.S. leadership. Without a different style and content of U.S. global leadership, we will not create the international system that we need for this century. And part of this is about moving from primacy to an understanding that we are an essential global leader, but not the global leader, and moving to the use of what I have called strategic empathy as opposed to strategic narcissism, which I think describes a lot of American policy in recent decades, and working not as the indispensable nation, as my friend Madeleine Albright used to refer to it, but rather thinking of the U.S. as, and trying to make the U.S. the indispensable partner in solving global problems. And that requires a huge amount of debate in the United States. And part of what I'm trying to do with my own work is to stimulate that debate. Because without that mind shift and political shift in the U.S., it's hard to imagine how we're going to get to the international system we need.
And I guess it's time to turn to the elephant in the room and talk about U.S. policy. The foreign policy team that Trump is putting together, does seem clearly aligned to a worldview that recognizes kind of strong, powerful states, and that we may be returning to a much more transactional modus operandi for international relations. And yet, I read a piece recently in Foreign Policy that referred to how the fear of Trump's impact on the UN had been overstated. And you'll hear some people like Patrick Stewart at Carnegie argue that actually, with some of the appointments that we've seen Trump make, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, even the UN ambassador, that yes, the Trump administration is not going to defend the global order, but it may not be as isolationist as we feared. How do you see things? Do you think that the Trump 2.0 administration is a greater threat to the UN now than during his first term?
It's very hard to assess. I do think there are mixed signals in the nominations that the president-elect has offered. Some of them are, I think, more acceptable in the sense that they see the international system and the UN as an essential forum for managing global affairs. Others are much less accommodating of that view. And of course, the key test of all of this is what President Trump himself will do. And the only thing we can predict is that he will be unpredictable. So to me, that is slightly good news in the fact that he does not have a coherent ideological stance about these things. He is very transactional, as you've said, Heba. And there may actually be these kind of surprising moments of opportunity that arise in the Trump years ahead that all of us in civil society in particular need to be ready to take advantage of. I think it calls on all of us to be very diligent in following what's happening. Two, to be very flexible and nimble. And three, to be ready to act and to mobilize, because there may be opportunities to accomplish positive things in all of the chaos that is likely to occur.
I see that a bit as I don't know if double-edged sword is the right expression or just a really big gamble, because on the one hand, you could argue that there is an opportunity in the fact that the Trump administration wants to shake up the institution of the UN. On the other hand, its goals are likely not aligned with those in civil society that are pushing for reform because they want to strengthen the UN rather than because they want to, blow it up or burn it down. And so I think we've already seen a tendency from some of those in civil society who had a stature of UN reform advocacy, moving away now from that into kind of defensive multilateralism. And we're already seeing, of course, with the attacks by the US in sanctioning the International Criminal Court. So, for those who do advocate for UN reform, what should their strategy be under this administration? Should they kind of hold back from too big of a reform focus and move into a different kind of defensive attitude?
Oh, I think we will have to play some defense. It's clear. We are going to be put in a position where it will be necessary to defend ideas. It will be necessary to defend organizations and institutions, and it will be also necessary to defend values. But if we only play defense, we won't make progress. And I think that we're going to have to do both simultaneously. And this is part of this notion of being very nimble. We're going to have to defend those things that require defense, while also looking for these moments of opportunity to make progress in the UN reform agenda. One thing thus far, and anything can change, on an hourly basis, but I don't see a coherent agenda of undermining the UN coming through the Trump transition.
Interesting.
I'm more expecting that they will largely ignore the UN unless there's something in particular that comes up of a transactional nature that they decide to focus on. And so I think we have to be ready for all the defensive work that may be necessary, but we can't give up on the reform agenda. And I think there's a narrative to communicate that the reform agenda actually can help resolve some of the things that some people in the Trump administration may offer as critiques of the UN as it exists. We all share critiques of the UN system. And in that kind of a context, we have to look for these opportunities to make progress while also defending those things that require defense.
How do you think middle power or small states should respond to the Trump administration? We've seen historically that when big powers undermine or try to undermine the UN or fail to fulfill their international responsibilities, this can lead to a reaction from other member states who, do have an interest in a robust multilateral system. And we saw that, in 2005 with the reforms led by Kofi Annan, which were in part a response to the Bush administration misleading the Security Council on the Iraq war, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that this could actually lead to renewed efforts at reform by other governments?
I certainly hope so. I do think I think that's the key, because we're not going to get the reform agenda that we really need from the major powers at this point. Certainly not from the US. The European powers are facing their own domestic political turmoil, so they're less likely to make a major effort here. And plus that, they're all, looking for advantage with the Trump administration. The rising powers, the middle powers, I think, are the key to this. And that's why I think it's also really terrific that C4UN works so closely with policymakers and civil society organizations in those countries, because I think that's where the change is going to come from. And I think we should all be working to support that and strengthen it, amplify it, and mobilize it.
I want to turn, kind of sticking with this theme of making progress in potentially difficult times, to someone in the audience. Selma is with us, I hope. She is with Global Women Leaders Voices and has a question for you. Over to you, Selma.
Thanks a lot, Heba. I completely agree that it's a great and clear roadmap, which is sometimes missing when we read reports. So I really like the fact that the report does give a clear instruction on how to make these shifts. And definitely, I think these are ideal changes for the world to be a better place, whether it be on a climate front, political side. And one that stuck with me is moving to a concept of positive peace instead of absence of war, which has not been dealt with, but I think it's a very important one. The only thing is that this lecture is both very comforting but overwhelming, because I am under the impression that we are going in the exact opposite direction. I quote, for example, after all, access to reliable information is essential for healthy democracies. And there's also this reform about the Intergovernmental Panel on the Information Environment. The only thing is that, as he just said, if we only play defense, we won't be making any progress. But I am afraid the situation is quite preoccupying, and I just wanted to know how to overcome this backlash, how to deal with that, because the situation as it is currently makes it really hard to think about these shifts from national interest and so on. So thank you very much. Thank you, Heba. Thank you, C4UN, for the opportunity to hear directly from Stephen Heintz. It's a huge pleasure.
Thank you very much, Salma. And I think you're right. And I will confess that I toggle back and forth between despair and anxious optimism. And on a good day, I am anxiously optimistic. I do think that if we look at the history of the UN itself, the reason that the global community was able to come together and establish the UN in 1945 was because of the absolute devastation of two world wars, but obviously most recently the Second World War. The world was in economic collapse, much of it. Europe was in physical devastation after the war. The United States was the undisputed hegemon, and the President of the United States, the two of them, Roosevelt first, but Truman as well, had a vision about trying to create a structure that would prevent another world war of that kind. So the UN was a reaction to calamity. And the challenge we're facing is that we need an international system that is preventative of calamity, because the existential threats we face are out there in the decades ahead if we don't manage them effectively. And it's much harder to actually create a system to prevent harm in the future than it is to create a system that responded to deep harm that was experienced in the World War. So you're right, Salma, that we have a huge challenge in order to accomplish this. But I do think that global citizens, and this is why a citizens' parliament or citizens' assemblies are so important. I think people around the world actually see this more clearly than their leaders. And they're experiencing it. The citizens of California are experiencing the devastation of climate catastrophe as we speak. The floods that happen across the world, the droughts that happen across the world, the crops and livelihoods that are destroyed. People are experiencing this every day all across the globe. And that is giving them a sensitivity to the fact that these things are not working. Sovereignty is not working because the nation state can't respond to these challenges. The international system is inadequate because it's too focused on national sovereignty. And the systems are too cumbersome and bureaucratic, and they have built-in kind of constraints that make it difficult to make progress. That awareness is really building. And this is what gives me the strength on the days that I feel, optimistic with a certain sense of anxiety. And but the key is all the work that you all do and the work that we need to keep doing together. Otherwise, we know this will not change.
And I increased the anxiety in just saying, I'm surprised to hear you say that, that regular citizens understand that the problems that they're facing in their day-to-day is actually linked to failures of global governance. I heard you speaking recently, and you said the American people are actually very interested in the ideas that you're putting forward. Where's the evidence of that they actually want and are ready to push for change in global governance?
Well, they're not, the way I would describe it, and polling, public polling demonstrates this, and the kinds of presentations I've been making and the kinds of responses I've been getting from, citizens suggest that they understand that the existing system is not managing effectively, and they want peace, they want more equitably shared prosperity, and they want a sustainable planet. So their aspirations are in the right place. And so it's up to all of us then to build from that base, to continue to help educate them, and to link their concerns about the global turbulence to a set of realistic and actionable reforms that can help us better manage. I think there is a kind of majority out there to be mobilized and strengthened toward this process of reform.
You have presented this paper in China. What kind of reactions did you get there?
Oh, it's fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I presented it a couple of times, mostly to people in the Chinese academic and think tank community. And to my surprise, there was also a lot of sympathy for the major shifts that I'm suggesting, and a lot of interest in some of the specific, reform proposals that I've offered. The one, of course, that I was most interested in seeing how people might react was this idea of creating a U.S.-China secretariat, because of the critical nature of this bilateral relationship and the fact that episodic conversation at high levels, while essential, is just not sufficient. And I expected the Chinese that I was speaking to absolutely reject this idea, but they didn't. They said it was a very intriguing idea. They acknowledged how important managing this relationship is. And they said maybe sometime in the future, this could be possible. And they also said maybe we should somehow model it in a civil society kind of framework, maybe like a track 2 kind of process. And so we are now exploring this. And then the other thing that happened, I some years ago was appointed by the Chinese government to serve on a very high level international advisory body on environment and development, and it is chaired by the vice premier. And so while I was in China, I participated in the annual general meeting of this council, and I was asked as one of the 6 international speakers to offer comments in the closing plenary with the vice premier in attendance. And I didn't give a long presentation of this work, but I gave a mini presentation of this work. And one of my Chinese colleagues came up to me afterwards and said, in his experience, very unusually, the vice premier actually took out a little notebook and was taking notes. So I thought, well, maybe I'm on some kind of a list now. But he said, no, I think he was really interested in your ideas. So, there wasn't a wholehearted embrace of this, but I wouldn't expect that. But there was real engagement, which is what I hoped for and really appreciated.
That area where I thought you would have gotten the most pushback, both in China and in the US, is around reform of the Security Council. And you have a few proposals in your report, both to expand the permanent membership, but also to limit the use of the veto. For example, by requiring 3 members to jointly exercise the veto or empowering the General Assembly to override the veto. Arguably, Security Council reform has more momentum now than it's ever had. There was a question in the chat from Suhail saying, do you think removing veto power from the archaic P5 would make the UN more effective? I'm assuming your answer is yes, but what likelihood do you think there is that we actually get a reformed Security Council in, say, the next 3 years? How do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, in the next 3 years, I think it's unlikely.
5?
Maybe. Here's what I would say, Heba. I am encouraged by the momentum around this debate. It's really, I think, significant that in the Pact for the Future coming out of the summit in September, there is stronger language about Security Council reform than we've seen in any other UN document. The U.S. Endorsed expanding the Security Council during the course of the debate on the Pact for the Future, which is also important. There are numerous proposals that have been made through broad international consultation. I've been participating in the Quincy Institute's Better Order project, and through that experience with people from all over the world, we came up with, I think, a very interesting proposal to increase both the size of the Security Council and to shift the veto. Again, the Global Governance Forum also has an interesting proposal. So there's more, I think, concrete work on this underway than any time in the last decade that I've seen. And the fact that the Pact for the Future says that this will continue to be an interest and a subject for continued work at the UN, including through the international negotiation process, to me gives us a window to work in. And whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, I can't predict. But I do think people are beginning to see that the Security Council, which was originally thought of as the institution that would preserve global peace, in its current configuration is incapable of doing that. And I think that awareness is leading more and more people to the conclusion that some Security Council reform, to make it more representative, to make it more transparent and democratic, and to overcome the constraints of a very strict veto policy or procedure, are going to be necessary. So I think this is a fertile area for future work.
But you do point out in the report that some of the structural flaws embedded in the UN Charter make, create pretty formidable barriers to reform. And that despite the fact that we're experiencing this kind of 1945-like moment with a breakdown of the current order, there is only so far we can go within the system as it is today because of the P5's, very smart move to ensure that they can block any future changes to the model. Brazil, South Africa, and India have recently called for a comprehensive review of the UN Charter, as allowed for by Article 109. You talk about the need for the US, among others, to launch a more inclusive process to design a more equitable and effective distribution of power and a new global system. Do you think that an Article 109 Charter Review Conference could be the answer to that more inclusive process that you're calling for?
I do think that an Article 109 conference is essential. I'm not sure whether it will be completely sufficient, because part of what we need to think about, and I make this point in the paper, is yes, we need to, as I phrase it, remake the UN. And I see the Article 109 conference as being the mechanism for remaking the UN. But we also need to supplement the UN or complement the UN with a variety of other kinds of mechanisms and institutions and processes. And I don't think that gets designed in an Article 109 conference. So I see it as central, but I also see that we need this additional work about how can we create the other things to create an ecosystem in the international realm that more effectively manages. And so, one of the successes of the UN climate process, of course, was the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, unlike Copenhagen, which was a disaster, the reason Paris was successful, in my view, and I was there, and we at the foundation support a lot of work around the UN FCCC process, was because it became a polylateral response to the climate crisis. It was not only governments and international institutions, it was the private sector, and critically, it was civil society. And all three sectors stepped up to the challenge in Paris and have contributed to the work since Paris. So these polylateral arrangements, to me, are really important because power resides in the private sector, money resides in the private sector, civil society is, closer to the people and represents people and places that are often overlooked. And so if we can build the structures for these polylateral arrangements, and they don't have to be permanent institutions, they can be, time-bound and issue-focused, et cetera. But those kinds of arrangements fall outside the kind of Article 109 conference.
Yes and no, in the sense that I mean, there are some international lawyers that would argue that the conference could agree to adopt something new altogether, in which case it wouldn't be bound by the rules of the current charter. But that's up for
If
legal
that's the
debate.
case, I'm not going to stand in the way.
Yeah. But I do want to ask about this idea of polylateralism, as you call it, and I recognize your point that you need processes outside of the UN given the limitations of the P5 veto. I heard you speak at an event recently in which the interviewer asked you whether global governance hadn't had its day. Why should the future lie? Why shouldn't it lie with minilateralism, coalitions of the willing, smaller groups of the like-minded? And you answered that's exactly what we need to do. And you suggest in your paper, for example, that the G20 could focus on issues like climate change and pandemic response and development finance. Why do you think an increase in kind of competing blocs would lead to greater cooperation rather than the opposite, i.e., greater adversarialism? How does that patchwork of different blocs actually help us solve the climate crisis, reduce nuclear weapons, et cetera? And if you take some of these discussions out of the UN, wouldn't you actually have the least powerful countries having even less of a voice?
Well, those are good and critical questions, and you could actually end up with that kind of world. But I think if we are conscious in the design of the future, we can minimize the chances of that. Now, the question about multiple blocks, in part, is an acknowledgement of reality. If I were just designing the ideal system, I wouldn't design necessarily a system of multiple blocks if we think of competing alliances of some kind. But it is the reality we face, and it points to flaws in the existing, UN system and the international system broadly, that middle powers, in association at times with great powers, feel the need to have their interests represented in different formats. So we're going to need to live with this, and the question is, can we create the structures in which the relationships among whatever blocks might develop are open, and there's trust and communication on a regular basis, and an effort and some mechanisms for resolving conflicts. I don't think that we have to assume, for example, that the BRICS are a threat to international peace. I think we should assume that the BRICS give us another organizing mechanism for working on challenges to international peace. And they will need to step up to this and prove that they really are interested in contributing to international peace. But I don't think we should start with the assumption that this is an increase in the risk as opposed to an opportunity for managing risk.
I want to bring in a question from Thomas in the audience, linked a bit to this notion of multi-stakeholder or network multilateralism, and it's something you reference in the paper as well. He says, does collaborative sovereignty include the efforts of global networks of local and subnational governments to elevate multi-level governance with a balance of power between nation states and other levels of governance?
Yes, I think that it absolutely does. And in the paper, in my discussion of the changes we need to make to the notion of national sovereignty, I talk about the need to strengthen the ability of the nation state to govern, but also the requirement that we do more devolution of power to local levels of governance, and in some cases delegate more authority up to planetary levels of governance for obvious reasons. And this means kind of diluting the nation state as the central locus and expanding the capability and the authority of these other levels of governance. And I think that is an essential part of the future system.
So much of what we've been talking about, however, depends on leadership. And you note in the report the transformative effect that visionary leaders can have, even in dark times. And yet we're constantly hearing about a lack of leadership. So we had a couple of questions actually from the audience around where these leaders should come from. Wallace says collaborative and human sovereignty is certainly a good point, but where will the leadership for this shift come from? Jay Mara says, what are the most important capacities for leaders to master in order to contribute to a more collaborative community? So where should this enlightened leadership come from?
Well, I obviously, if we look at the history of the UN, the leadership really did come not exclusively, but in large part through Western leaders like Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who in the Atlantic Charter really laid out, an extraordinary vision of a world in which rights would be protected and the great powers would eschew the use of force in solving global problems. It was a bold, almost utopian vision when you consider where the world was in 1941. So, ideally, we would see that kind of leadership emerge again. I also, by the way, in my research, went back and read Mikhail Gorbachev's speech to the General Assembly in 1988, which is an incredible document, a truly visionary statement that really, surprised everybody, even shocked a lot of people, including the fact that at the end of that speech, he said he was withdrawing 500,000 troops from Eastern Europe. And so there was another moment of an individual leader for many reasons. The Soviet Union was, facing economic collapse, et cetera. So he had incentives, but nevertheless, no Soviet leader before ever would have made that kind of a speech. So I think that is still possible. And maybe in 4 years, we Americans will elect a president who's capable of that kind of leadership. That would be the ideal thing. But, since the world has changed so much, I really think the leadership is going to have to be collective. And I think it's going to have to come largely from the middle powers and the rising powers. And this is why I really salute President Lula for his speech at the General Assembly and calling for a charter review conference. And we're going to have to see coalitions of leaders like that. And it will only occur, in my view, through the kinds of transnational civil society organizing that you all are engaged in and that we try to support at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
I'm going to ask you something of an uncomfortable question, perhaps, which is that the current Secretary General, I think, is becoming relatively unpopular among UN insiders who criticize him for not being courageous enough at a time when we need such leadership. Just last week, the Daily Maverick published an op-ed with the title, "Dear UN Secretary General, your tenure has been a failure on multiple fronts." How would you assess Guterres's performance while in office, given the kind of leadership we need for the shifts you're outlining? And given that at the end of this year, we will start seeing the campaign for the new And next Secretary General, for which the expectation is that it would be a woman from Latin America or the Caribbean, who is your vote for the next SG?
Well, to the first point to the first point of your question, um, first I think we have to acknowledge that any Secretary General has one of the most difficult jobs on the planet, especially given the way the UN is structured and the kinds of constraints that are built into the charter that we have been discussing this morning. So I have a lot of sympathy with any UN Secretary General. I think this Secretary General has at times provided really important normative leadership. He has been very clear in his speeches and in his commentary about the nature of the crises we face, and he has injected a language of urgency and a language based on values that I really appreciate. And I have been in forums with him where he's made these kinds of comments, and they've been really impressive. He was the one who set out to organize this Summit of the Future and put a lot of his own leadership behind it and resources to make it happen. And did it accomplish everything that we all would like? No, of course not. Do we need to up the ambition in the years ahead? Absolutely. But it was a very, very important step forward, which creates opportunity for more progress. So I give him pretty high marks on that too. I think in the peace and security field, given the P5 arrangement and the veto problem, it was highly unlikely that he was going to be able to do anything else than what he has done. I think the fact that he did invoke Article 99 was really important. That's only been done a handful of times in the entire history of the UN. It doesn't have, teeth and enforcement mechanism, but he used the power that the charter granted to him. I do think looking forward, so that's kind of looking at today and looking backward. Looking forward, we need a woman to be the next Secretary General of the UN. This is overdue. And there are lots of good women candidates, and I'm not going to pick one today. I know several of them, and I think we will be well served by any number of the candidates that are currently known, and there may be other candidates that emerge, which is very exciting. Second, we at the foundation, and I personally was involved in helping the UN to design the system for electing the Secretary General that occurred when Guterres was elected. And I am glad to see that it looks like that system will be utilized again. In other words, more transparency, more participation, some debates among the candidates, et cetera. And I think that's very important that now become the norm for electing a Secretary General. And I think that if we all in civil society focus the debate not about personality, but about values and approaches and reform ideas, and ask the tough questions of the candidates. What is your agenda for UN reform or international system reform? And also share the ideas that we generate in an effective way with the candidates. This is an important part of what we can do to get a good outcome. So it's a real opportunity, and we really have to seize it and work hard to get a woman elected, and a woman who shares the kind of vision that I think we all broadly share about the future.
And I do hope that C4UN can have a kind of presidential debate with all of the candidates when we get to that stage.
That would be great. That would be great.
I have one last question as we close, and I apologize to all of those there were too many questions, so we might have to do a round two, Stephen. But that is, you write in your essay that it is meant to address what might be and not just what can be, and that history is replete with examples where improbable change happens. And we can think of the end of slavery, the women's right to vote, even the creation of the UN. And yet, often when I engage with people about UN reform, particularly things like, reforming the UN Charter, you get the reaction of being naive. And so I wonder, and you acknowledge that, right, that these ideas can seem idealistic or utopian. how do we try to land some of these ideas in this kind of realpolitik world in which we live? Benedicta was asking, should we be persistent in being utopian? And Jacques asks, how do you see the world in 2050? So I wonder if you could just end us off with your vision for the future, but also how you respond to these critiques of naivete or utopia when talking about these issues.
Guilty as charged. I think that it is essential that we have debate that is not just about the small things that can be today, but the big things that need to be in the future. If we don't have that kind of discussion, if we don't have vision, if we don't think about what would the ideal situation be, we will never get close to it. So I think it's absolutely essential that we have visionaries, that we have utopians, and I don't really mind that criticism. And you're right. Part of it from personal experience. I was in Berlin 1 month before the Berlin Wall was breached, and I went through Checkpoint Charlie from west to east the day after Gorbachev had been in East Berlin celebrating with Erich Honecker the 40th anniversary of the founding of the German Democratic Republic. And I spent the day in East Berlin. I went back through Checkpoint Charlie to the west, and I left Berlin thinking this wall was an abomination, but it wasn't going to change in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And 1 month later, to everybody's surprise, the CIA didn't predict this. Really, nobody predicted this. A very dramatic change took place. And so change is possible. It's less possible if we give up thinking about it and trying to make it happen. And that's what I hope this paper and these kinds of discussions will contribute to. Small steps toward a larger vision.
Well, thank you for daring to hope. Thanks for sharing that vision with us today, and for joining us on Bilateral. I hope we'll have another opportunity to get to all the other questions. Maybe I'll curate them and send you a list.
Would you actually? I'd appreciate it. If
I would be very happy to. Yeah.
Send out the chat to me. Kind of collate the chat and send it to me. I'd be really grateful. And I'm happy to keep this conversation going if there's if there's interest, and another time we can do it.
Sounds great. And thank you to all of you who have joined us. If you do have any follow-up or suggestions of guests you'd like invited onto future editions of Bilateral, you can send us an email at C4UNWN, so Coalition for the UN We Need. That's the number 4. C4UNWN at C4UNWN.org. We'll drop that into the chat as well, and you can find us on social media or on our website, C4UNWN.org. Until next time, it's still January, so I will take this opportunity to wish everyone a more peaceful 2025. And thanks again, Stephen, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.